When I started working on the sermon for this week, I thought, oh, the Transfiguration, that's kind of interesting. I don't know what to do with it. And I thought I'd focus on the second half of the chapter. And it turns out we will only be talking about the Transfiguration today. But I want to give us a little bit of where we've been in Matthew. So early on, James introduced this series and gave us kind of this image of the 5 different chunks of Matthew. And this is the incredibly readable image from the Bible Project. Because I appreciate, and why I put this up here, even though I know you can't actually see what's going on with it, is there's so much depth, there's so much complexity in how God is communicating through Matthew what's happening here. And there's various, again, sections, kind of like phases of the book. So it started off with the first part, connecting Jesus to the Old Testament. So we have that kind of zoomed in, that the first few chapters, we see how Jesus is placed in a particular historical and family context, how Jesus comes out of the family of David. He's born in the midst of Roman occupation. He's born at this time when Herod the Great is declared to be the king of the Jews. And as Jesus comes of age, he's preaching the good news. He's announcing God's kingdom to the world. He's announcing this radical life of love and sacrifice. And we see where Jesus is bringing this kingdom into people's lives, where he's healing the lepers, healing the sick and the paralyzed, casting out demons, the blind see, the mute speak. Something is different. Something is different about how Jesus is interacting. And we see how people respond, that some people recognize him as the Messiah. Some are curious. They're kind of like, is he the Messiah? But they're not quite sure. And there's others who are just opposed. They say, this can't be right. He is not the Messiah. And so that brings us into the 4th section where we currently are. That, depending on who you think Jesus is he the Messiah? Is he not? People have these different expectations of what he's supposed to be. And we have these different things going on. So we have a slide that has the 4th part on it. There we go. Who do the Jewish people think that the Messiah is supposed to be? And so we saw that at the start of chapter 16, that the religious leaders demanded that Jesus prove himself. They demanded that he show a sign from heaven. And Jesus doesn't just do what they want. Jesus asked his disciples, well, who do people say the Son of Man is? And when Brianna preached about this a couple of weeks ago, she did such a good job, and I just keep saying, just go listen to her. I can't summarize it well, but I just keep thinking about how directly Jesus asked Peter, well, who do you say I am? That we as the listener are confronted with that same question. Who do you say Jesus is? Who is Jesus? And you actually live like that. Does your life match? Or do you treat Jesus kind of like, oh, kind of a good idea? Do you treat Jesus kind of like a buddy? Or do you recognize Jesus for who he truly is? And that kind of brings us, that's what brings us to the start of chapter 17 with the Transfiguration. And that's where Jesus says, this is who I am. Jesus shows his disciples who he is. So I'm going to read out the first part of Matthew 17, and I'm going to be reading from the Kingdom New Testament, in part because it helps us get out of our, you've heard it in one translation all the time, and so you kind of you think you know what's coming next. And so this one is, same but different, translated a little differently. So if you're trying to read along, good luck. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and James' brother John, and led them off up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transformed in front of them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Then, astonishingly, Moses and Elijah appeared to them. They were talking with Jesus. Peter just had to say something. Master, he said to Jesus, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them. Then there came a voice out of the cloud. This is my dear son, said the voice, and I'm delighted with him. Pay attention to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were scared out of their wits. Jesus came up and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they raised their eyes, they saw nobody except Jesus, all by himself. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them strict instructions. Don't tell anyone about the vision, he said, until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. So why, ask the disciples, do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Elijah does indeed come, says Jesus, and he will restore everything. But let me tell you this, Elijah has already come, and they didn't recognize him. They did to him whatever they wanted, and that's how the Son of Man too will suffer at their hands. Then the disciples realized that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. So this image, we see this constantly as people encounter Jesus, and a lot of times we have 2,000 years later, we're like, well, how could you not see? How did you not know that was Jesus? How did you not see what God was doing? And it's such keeps happening over and over. It's this essential truth about how God works in this world and how humans notice. And the simple, I say simple, but we keep missing it. The truth is, and this is my attempt at a one-point sermon, God is working even when we don't recognize what's happening. God is working even when we don't recognize what's happening. And in this case, they didn't recognize how God was working through John the Baptist. They didn't see it, and people kept not recognizing the Messiah. And the teachers of the law, they had put together an image of what the coming of the Messiah would look like. They had this thought of who they thought the Messiah would be, how they thought things would unfold. And I appreciate the way that N.T. Wright has the series, like each book of the Bible for everyone, or each of the New Testament for everyone. And I appreciate the way that he frames this because he shows the good-hearted intention. And I think this is one of these things that sometimes we want to be just like really critical and say like, oh, the Pharisees were just like so dumb, or they were so focused on their own. And it's like, well, the more we tear them down, the more we think, oh, I won't do the same thing. But there's so many things that the Pharisees are doing that we slip into all too quickly. So I wanted to read the way that N.T. Wright frames it in his book, Matthew for Everyone, Part 2. And I would like to give a brief shout out to the church library that Matt Carruthers is king of. This is not from his library, this is from my library, but y'all have this one too, right? Yeah, cool. So if you want to read it, check it out. So he describes this image that the scribes and Pharisees and teachers of the law, they thought they knew what the Messiah would look like. And N.T. Wright writes out, well, where did their timetable come from? Like almost everything else in Judaism, from their scriptures. The prophet Malachi declared that God would send Elijah the prophet to prepare the people before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Elijah had purified the people with terrifying strictness before his own moment of terror, face to face with God on the mountain in 1 Kings 19. Eventually in the story, he was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. The rumor went round that perhaps he hadn't died properly, that he would return one day. Malachi makes that hope concrete and specific, and some other later Jewish texts repeat it in various forms. One such text, the Wisdom of Ben Sirah, sometimes called Ecclesiasticus, was written about 200 BC and speaks of Elijah restoring the tribes of Jacob. Jews of the time often referred to their nation in this way. Israel was the special name that God had given to the ancestor Jacob. Those who studied and taught such texts developed this timetable of events for them. When things got really bad, God would send Elijah to get Israel ready. Then, when the Messiah came, he would take up the work from there. The disciples are puzzled. They had just seen declared that Jesus is the Messiah, and now they have seen him conversing with Moses and Elijah. But if he was the Messiah, Elijah should have appeared first, not halfway through the work. Jesus' answer shows that the timetable had moved on without them realizing it. The timetable was correct. What they had missed was that John the Baptist was Elijah. Why had the disciples not recognized John as Elijah? Because they were looking for the wrong sort of person. It was exactly the same reason why they didn't understand Jesus saying, in the previous chapter, now again here, that he was himself going to suffer and die as the climax of his own vocation. And what I wanted to really highlight out of that is they were deriving their beliefs from Scripture. They were looking at what was in Kings, what was in Malachi, what was in their other texts, and they said, okay, if we connect these dots, this makes sense. And they created this image, and they thought they could predict what was going on in the future. But then when God was moving, and God is always moving, they didn't recognize what God was doing. But God is always working, even when we don't recognize it. And so I said I have a one-point sermon, but I had a counterpoint to the point. Our attempts to predict what God is doing are often or usually wrong. That as amazing as it is to look around and say, I know that God is working, sometimes we get so concrete and we're like, oh, I see exactly what God is doing. And then we miss it. We miss what God was actually doing in the midst of that. And I wanted to give both a big picture example of this and then a small picture example. And I go in this order because, this big picture one, some of us were from backgrounds that really bought into this. And some of us look at that and say, wait, why would you do that? But I think I go to various apocalyptic predictions of the end of the world. As a person raised in a house that was rapture ready, there's stories. There's all of these signs that people come up with and say, they're constantly trying to look at world events and say, this is what's ushering in the end times. This is what's going to come to the end times. Whatever's happening right now that I just saw on the news yesterday, that's the sign. And what's interesting about that is we keep making these predictions and they keep not being true yet. And, spoiler alert, when you get to Matthew 25 or 24 and 25, Jesus is telling us to always be ready. We know that there's an end to this age, that at some point this era of life ends. And the message that Jesus tells us is, be prepared. You never know. We are not called to live in fear. We are called to be constantly ready, to live every day, to know that we need that right relationship with God. But there's this worldly attitude that tells us, oh, we should be scared of what's happening. And it turns into this divisive attitude. Instead of something that's really meant to say, every single day I should live in right relationship with God, in right relationship with those around me. Every single day is the correct day to forgive somebody, to reach out, to show love. But there's that thing that's just so seductive about the end times. And that thing, just as the teachers of the law had drawn the dots between various beliefs, various verses, and they thought they knew what Elijah would look like, and they missed it. We do the same thing generation after generation after generation. And I would really love to go through every single century dating back, about 2,000 years, because it genuinely pops up every single century. And every single time it's like, did you forget about the last apocalyptic prophecy? And it does seem to be tied with whenever there's times of political or social upheaval that we're not really sure what is steady, we cultivate and create these things. And, I could talk about the mid-20th century era of late great planet Earth. I could talk about the 1840s. I really love that there was a prediction in the 1840s that the end of times was going to be October 22nd, 1844. Very specific date. It got to be known as the Great Disappointment, which is a setup for so many quality jokes. But then people are like, okay, so that wasn't actually the end of times. Actually, that was a heavenly event happened. Or I love talking about the radical Reformation and people that thought they were ushering in the New Jerusalem in Germany in the 1530s. But again, not that today. I want to get to community sharing. It is not new. But this is what happens when we're relying on human wisdom. We speak with too much confidence. We think we know exactly what God is going to be doing, and we're wrong. And the thing that is just so tragic about what happens there, that it seems to make it impossible for people to actually be prophetic truth tellers in the midst of that, to speak into the actual brokenness of the world. And you hear about these just outrageous stories of end times cults, or people that are like, well, they're not full-on end time cults, but it seems that they've missed what we're called here to do. They've missed the point of going out and just loving God's people and serving each other. But the truth is, God is working. God is making whatever's going to happen, he's making it happen. and we can act like we know what's coming, but it genuinely should not change how we're loving each other and serving each other day to day. We don't want to turn into relying on our own wisdom and missing what God is doing. So that was the big picture one. And I think, maybe you're thinking, oh, I'm not prone to getting sucked into the apocalyptic teachings, or I'm not going to do that one. But I see it happen so much, and I do this to other people, and I see us do it to each other all the time, that we know that God is constantly working, but sometimes we try to guess a little too precisely what is happening in our lives. And so I'll talk about just that, constant pain of life known as suffering. We know that God makes good things come out of suffering. We know that God can take the most awful situations and use it for good. What was intended for harm can be used for good. But too often, we try to jump ahead and guess for other people's lives and say, oh, you just need to identify exactly what God's trying to teach you. It's like, well, maybe not right now. So often it's in hindsight that we see that. Years later, we look back and say, I see how God used that. But too often we try to cram people and bully people into seeing in that moment, instead of giving them the space to grieve. And as we see that Jesus walks with people who are grieving and suffering. And so that's something that we know God is working. But we can't pretend that we know exactly what God is doing in the midst of that, because that turns into us imposing our faulty wisdom onto others again. And it's no different from the teachers of the law who missed out on what the Messiah was doing and who the Messiah was. So as I wrap this up, I wanted to read a couple of more paragraphs from N.T. Wright about this. I know there's so much more in Matthew 17 that is worth talking about, but I wanted to just focus on this piece about seeing how God is working. John the Baptist hadn't come to blast everyone into shape with celestial thunderbolts. He was a voice, warning of what was to come, but himself dying under the weight of the evil he had denounced. Jesus hadn't come to sweep all before him with a blaze of power. He had come to bring God's kingdom of love and power. And the way to that kingdom is to lay down the road of suffering. We shouldn't miss the fact that it was immediately after he had announced his own commitment to the road of suffering and invited his followers to come down it with him that he was revealed in glory and blazing light on the mountain. So where are you in God's timetable? The risk of faith is that we often don't know the answer to that question in our own lives. Often we only discover what God was doing in and through us when we look back. But when we look beyond ourselves to God's wider picture, we should know the answer. The timetable of what God is doing in the world is going ahead. If we want to play our part in it, we must follow where Jesus himself leads, all along the way of the cross, of self-renunciation and service. Or do y'all remember what John's one point was last week? Go low, that life of service. If we want to play our part in what God is doing in the world, we follow where Jesus leads, the way of the cross, self-renunciation and service. And for us, the most important event in the timetable has already occurred. Jesus himself was raised from the dead. The secret is out. All of history is bathed in the light of Easter. Our task is to find our own role and vocation in following Jesus and helping that light to shine through the world. And so hopefully I've left plenty of time for us to have community sharing, but we should have a couple of slides on that one again. Again, like when we share with each other, we want it to be applicable, biblical, and concise. And then I have a couple of specific questions. Our classic community sharing question is, how have you seen God moving around you? And a lot of times we could say so many things about how God is moving around us. And I also have a different wording of that, of how have you seen God's faithfulness and goodness? So whichever question connects to you better, we have a microphone. John will run around in circles so that we can get it on the recording and so that everybody can hear you. But I'm really excited to hear how God has been moving in y'all's lives, what God is teaching you, and how you're seeing God's faithfulness and goodness.
Hey guys, so as a lot of you know, life has been pretty hectic lately. my grandmother moved out of the house a few months ago, so I've been living at her house home alone and trying to move out. And I'm officially going to move out in 2 weeks. And but there's a lot of things that still need to happen, like getting a job. But so many people have stepped up to help me in this process. For example, Natalie and Amanda are going to try to help me out along with their husbands during moving day. Melissa and Justin are going to be taking my cat with them for a year until I can move out to a place that allows animals. And Alex and David are going to be paying my first month's rent so that I can move in with them. And it's stressful, but it's also a blessing to see all this help, all these people around me helping me, making sure that I'm taken care of. And along with that, I have friends like Bree and Molly and Ari who are constantly checking up on me. Ari texted me last night at like 10:30 at night, and I was already asleep and still haven't replied. Don't worry, Ari, I will text you back at some point. So yeah.
I just wanted to share about track. For about a year, we were meeting in our house, but a couple weeks ago, we started meeting at North Point Church of Christ. So it's really helpful for a lot of reasons that we get to use their building, but they've been really sweet to us, and it's neat that even though our church ended up not meeting there, we still have a lot of connections, and we get to use their space, and they were really blessing us with that. And some of the people from North Point actually come to track, and it's just neat, like still getting to kind of work with them and partner with them in the kingdom, even though like our church doesn't meet there. Yeah, and so track is the ministry. It's the ministry me and Jordy lead. It's for college-age people, but who don't go to college or aren't on the traditional college track. And so that's why we call it that. It's like an alternative track to college. So, but of course, we don't draw hard lines. Like Jordy has a degree. I dropped out. Some people are still in school, but yeah, if focus like isn't the right place for you, I think track would be a good alternative. And so, yeah, if y'all know anybody, like we definitely want y'all to invite them. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so we just got back from Sikkim trip, and it was like a whole 10 days of like just learning about God and stuff. And when I get involved in these type of events, it really gets me thinking about how much God has changed my life, especially when being surrounded with so many beautiful people. And if it wasn't for like focus and things like that, I don't think I would be like fully deep rooted into my faith as it is now. So I just seen God move in so many cool ways. I was mentioning to Colton and a few of the guys here how just like if it wasn't for like the baseline we have of like faith, how much like these friendships wouldn't be like spiritual friendships. But now that we've, have like the same commonality and stuff like that, it's turned into like lifelong friendships. So like with learning about Sikkim, it was very much like, how can I apply this to my adult life? So with like joining track, I just want to like learn more about how I can apply all the things I learned to my adult life.
Seriously, babe. I know.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what Melissa was saying, how all too often we jump in front of God, and that comes out of a lack of patience and a lack of trust in God. And it's crazy because when I look back to when I didn't know him, now I can look back and think the way, he relentlessly pursued me even though I didn't know who he was, but that he did it in all these creative ways. Like God will do his deal, period. And he'll do it in big ways. Like he had to move me to Texas to pluck me in a new place and encounter people to teach me about who he was and the life trajectory that has had on our entire family. But the challenge is it taught me to trust and surrender to his plan, and to be okay that that's not going to happen right away. But you'll always be able to look back and just be like, God, I now see what you were doing. You know, driving by a sign in San Diego that said Texas, and then my little personality going, I think I'm going to move to Texas. Like, that's how it happened. He used that in me to direct my steps, and we just serve such a faithful and good God. He's going to do his deal with you. So just be patient and trust.
few more? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a little bit more about our Sikkim trip. If you're unfamiliar with our college ministry focus, every year we take students up to Bellingham, Washington for a week of college ministry education, really, like how to minister to people, how to lead small groups. And I just think that is something significant. If you didn't know, we brought 150 of our college students up to Bellingham, and I'm like, that is just God moving on our college campuses. You know, like, we as a church get to be a part of our college kids' lives in a way that's super significant. I mean, like, there was 20 Washington students there, and then 150 of us. And just throughout the week, I just saw how amazing that is, that these students got to spend a week really learning how to minister to each other. And like Oscar shared, like, these are skills that will go on for the rest of their lives. And so I just think that's such a cool way that God's been working in our church and college ministry.
Somebody start a timer in the back.
Happy birthday to you. That's not really what I wanted to say. But, you know, we are working John pretty hard for an old man. What I wanted to talk about, I've started going to a Bible study that Natalie leads and that Pam has been so graciously hosting for us. And we were talking on Friday about just different stuff. We get pretty deep, and this group of ladies has been together for a while. And I mean, it's really gotten deep, and we've all grown to know. And if you're not in some type of group like this, man, I wish you would get in one, because we have people in our group that have struggled with stuff, myself included, their whole lives. And, you know, if you're isolated, you get to thinking you're the only one that probably has ever experienced that or felt that. And you get with a group that can be really open and can be really honest and trust the people that they're around to kind of, you know, keep their mouths closed and not share it with the whole world. You can grow and learn so much. And, you know, I was isolated for a number of years, especially since I've been at this church, because I felt like the old lady. I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere. But I've found out that doesn't have anything to do with anything. It doesn't. And you know, that's Satan. Satan wants to convince us that we don't have a spot, we don't have a place. So I really recommend that if you're not in a group of peers, and it doesn't matter if they're young like me or old like Pam, you know, it doesn't matter. We're all dealing with the same stuff, just a little bit different. And, you know, I just feel so blessed. You know, I've been pretty selfish. It was pretty hard for me to start getting up and being there at 8:30, and I can't tell you I'm always there right at 8:30, but I'm getting up and going and looking forward to it. So if you don't have a community, if you don't have a group and you feel isolated, you need to talk to somebody. You can talk to Pam, you can talk to Natalie, and, you know, you can even talk to me if you dare. But but I wanted to shout that out. They you know, it's never announced, really. I don't know why. It's not a secret, but anyway, is this applicable? No. Oh, okay.
It was for about 90% of it. You were on track, and then you just shot off some other direction. But that's cool. We love you.
Hey, yeah, so Matt and I are also moving soon. And it was a weird God deal. We weren't looking for a house, and this house just kind of fell into our lap. And it was a God deal from the beginning. It was a blessing in so many ways, but the biggest one being it brought us closer to family. And yeah, I mean, it was a sweet God deal, and I recognized that. But then I had a friend point out that, hey, a few months ago when this house came up, you were in a pretty low spot. I was really just down and sad that I was just sad about my family, not having them here and not having their support. And that friend pointed out, like, you're moving across the street from your in-laws, from Matt's family, and this house just randomly popped up when you were going through that. And so I feel like, yeah, it was like what Melissa was saying about it's hard to recognize sometimes what God is doing or where he's going. But it's, one, important to surround yourself with godly friends that'll point out, hey, this seems like God. I think God is moving. I think God is working. And then two, that, yeah, when we look back, we can see the good things that he's done. And yeah, it just leaves me, I feel like I'm always humbled that God thinks I'm worthy of these good gifts and that he just keeps, I feel like, pouring them out and pouring them out. So I feel really humbled and really grateful that God's been so giving and so generous.
One more? Yes, Pam.
I'm not sure how applicable it is, but it's really sweet. So my husband and I are gardeners, and we have a lot of fruit trees. And so it was time to harvest our plum tree. And Dan was calling various people. And I got to watch Justin and Dan harvest our plum tree yesterday. And, their height is a lot different. There was a ladder. And Dan's a seasoned harvester and Justin's new to it. And you know what? It doesn't matter how much you know about God. The harvest is plentiful and the workers are few. And you don't have to be just alike. You don't have to be a super experienced or inexperienced. I mean, God can work with all of us.
Thank you guys for sharing. That was really, really cool to get to hear from all you guys. Let's go ahead and be standing. We're going to sing one more song together.